Welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled The Anatomy of a Food Recall, hosted by the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association and presented by Amy Philpott of Watson Green and one of the 3 members of the Recall Ready team. This is the second webinar in our Crisis Communications webinar series. Feel free to access all 5 webinars found on the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Crisis Management webpage at www.gfvga.org. I'm Beth Olson, Director of Education and Food Safety for the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and will be moderating today's webinar. Now, before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Please note this is a pre-recorded webinar, but even with being a pre-recorded webinar, technology has made it possible for you to submit questions at any time during this webinar. Simply type your questions into the questions text box. At the end of this webinar, all submitted questions will be sent to us and we will answer them via email. There will be an FAQ housed on the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. If you experience any issues with audio coming through your computer speakers, please make sure your computer speakers are on and the volume is turned up. You may also use the telephone dial-in option. Lastly, I would like to draw your attention to the handout box on the webinar control box. The handout box contains links to today's presentation and other useful tools such as Is Your Company Prepared for a Recall Checklist, produced by the United Fresh Recall Ready program. Now, with the housekeeping items behind us, let's get to the webinar. Today's webinar, The Anatomy of a Food Recall, will review how a recall unfolds and how a plan can help you prepare. Again, this is the second of 5 webinars in a series designed to help prepare for a crisis before it begins. Industry experts would agree the best time to prepare for a crisis is not once it happens. And for the large majority of instances, most crises are not expected. The Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association has a crisis communication and management plan available for members to use as an outline to create a specific crisis communication and management plan for their farm or produce operation. It is designed to conform and help address most any crisis, such as foodborne illness, labor shortage, weather, or even the unfortunate accidental employee death. The 5 webinars in this crisis communication series are designed to provide high-level information and overview in a short amount of time. After the webinar, if more in-depth technical information is needed, you are welcome to contact me, Beth Olson, with the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, any of the 3 presenters from the Recall Ready program, or attend a Recall Ready workshop offered through the United Fresh Produce Association. Speaking of the Recall Ready team, today our presenter is one of the Recall Ready team trio, Amy Philpott. Amy specializes in crisis communication and reputation management for food and agriculture companies. She works with companies to prepare for food product recalls and is a resource for companies during recalls and other crises. Before joining Watson Green, she managed crisis communications and general communications for the United Fresh Produce Association, handling the association's communications during several high-profile foodborne illness outbreaks. Amy grew up in California's San Joaquin Valley, where she helped cultivate and market grapes and oranges grown on her family's farm. It is with this great wealth of expertise and renown that I now turn the presentation over to Amy Philpott.
Thank you, Beth. I'm delighted to be a part of this webinar series by the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. You know, one of the reasons I like to begin this discussion with talking about how recalls unfold is because The way a company learns about a potential food safety issue and what has happened before they even get notification has a serious impact on their crisis response. So generally speaking, there are two ways that recalls unfold. The first one, there's a health implication first, so there might be reported illnesses, for example, and health authorities are investigating to find what the problem is or what the source of the illnesses are. The second one is that there's a problem that's detected, or let's say a positive test result, for example, and that's discovered first, and then action is taken to prevent a health implication or a negative health implication. So let's look at the first one. Illnesses drive a search for a source. We're going to look at how these outbreaks are detected, how long it takes to detect them, and what it means for the company. The first is, let's get on the level playing field and understand that an outbreak is only 2 or more samples that are genetically indistinguishable. So it may be 2 clinical illnesses, it may be 1 clinical illness and a food sample, but it only takes 2. That's the important part. When we talk about outbreaks, many of the outbreaks that make the news are in the tens or hundreds of people that are involved. But the definition of an outbreak is only 2 or more samples. There's a national database called PulseNet that tracks these illnesses, and there's also whole genome sequencing database called Genome Tracker that tracks the pathogens that contribute to illnesses. In Dr. McIntyre's presentation, which I believe is webinar number 4, she mentions the Genome Tracker. And of course, health officials are constantly monitoring to determine when there is an outbreak. So let's look at how long it takes to report an outbreak. This is in the case of salmonella infection. And you can see here that a person is exposed to the pathogen, that is, they eat something that is contaminated, and it may take a couple of days before they feel bad, and they may feel bad for a couple of days, say 1 to 5 days, before they go to the doctor, and the doctor takes a stool sample, and it takes about another 1 to 3 days to diagnose, yes, this is salmonella. That has to be shipped, that sample has to be shipped to a public health laboratory that CDC and FDA use, and where it will be typed out, or the lab will essentially identify the DNA fingerprint of the pathogen. And then it's entered into the database, the national database, and it's compared with others. And if there are matches and they get more than 1 sample that has the same serotype or the same DNA, then they have an outbreak. Notice that the total time here is 2 to 4 weeks. That's why when you see these, what they call outbreak epi curves put out by CDC, there'll be this shaded part at the end of the curve and a notice that says illnesses that started during this time may not yet be reported. That's because this is how long it takes from the time someone consumes a contaminated food to the time it actually gets into the database where it would show up on this curve. Now keep in mind, that's for salmonella. If we're talking Listeria monocytogenes, that can take much longer because there is up to a 70-day incubation period. So from the time someone consumes a contaminated food to the time that they feel ill can take as long as 70 days, although Typically, it's more around 5 or 6 weeks. Nevertheless, that's much longer than salmonella, which is 1 to 5 days you would feel poorly. So what does that mean for a company? Well, if the company source is identified, right, if in the investigation the health authorities have identified a company, then you're likely to get a call from FDA and or CDC that goes something like, hello, this is FDA, are you prepared to do a recall? And that's perhaps a little more blunt, but not much. The pressure when there are illnesses already associated with what they believe to be your product, the pressure to issue a recall is tremendous, and health authorities will strongly encourage you to do that. So in your plan, you've already identified who answers that phone, and if somebody else answers it, what are they going to do with that phone call? Who are they going to transfer it to? What is that person going to say? And what is the company going to do? How is it going to respond? I want to point out here that in Webinar 3, David Durkin with OFW Law goes into some detail about interacting with regulatory officials. And in Webinar number 4, Dr. Jennifer McIntyre with United Fresh Produce Association gives more information about how outbreaks are traced to a company. So you might want to refer to those as well. So let's say an investigation has led the officials to your company. What does this mean? Well, hopefully you have a plan in place and you can put it into action right away. But on a larger scale, what it means is you are unfortunately 100% reactive, right? Because you didn't know before this that you were involved. So the news about the illnesses has already gotten out. There's already momentum in the news story and in the investigation that you haven't been a part of. So you're reacting to a lot more, not taking control of it or struggling to take control of it. There are illnesses already, which of course is not a good situation to be coming into. And of course that increased the potential cost of your recall. It also is very likely to mean that the scope of your recall is going to be much larger than if the problem were caught before it caused illnesses. Again, I encourage you to watch webinar number 4 to listen about traceability and scope. But what if the company source isn't determined? And we've seen a couple of these examples recently where there's an outbreak, FDA and CDC have identified a product but not a company or not one specific company. What happens then? Well, you might think that, well, if there isn't a company identified, then it won't affect us. But that just simply isn't true. The mere fact that you sell the product that's in the same category affects you. Your customers will be asking you questions. You will very likely be getting questions from consumers, especially if you package a brand. And the long-term impact on the entire category is going to be much greater than if a company is determined and that one company deals with it and it's over with. If there is no source determined, then the doubt in consumers' minds and customers' minds, for that matter, lingers. And that has the longer-term impact on the category. Customers often temporarily stop buying altogether, and that's because consumers stop buying. Granted, you don't have to do a trace back or a trace forward, and you're not doing a root cause analysis because you haven't been pinpointed, but nevertheless, you still have customer communications public communications. You may or may not get calls from the media. Typically, if your company isn't named, you won't, but you never know. As a supplier of a particular product that is being implicated in an outbreak, you might. So the communication pressures can still be great, even if it's a category issue and not a company issue. What happens in the second situation, where a problem is detected and then action is taken to drive prevention of illnesses? We'll do the same thing. We'll look at how that problem is detected, what happens next, and what it means for a company. All right, the first thing is don't panic. You have a plan, and you're going to organize. You're going to resist that initial adrenaline rush that wants you to panic, and you're going to grab your plan and you're going to move forward in a fashion that is orderly and logical. So what information do you have, right? You've detected a problem, okay? So maybe your own testing detected a problem. Maybe a customer detected a problem. The first thing you have to do is confirm there's actually a problem, right? Just because you have a positive test doesn't necessarily mean you have a recall. What it means is that you have to surround yourself with more information and the right people, those external resources that you've listed in your plan, to help you determine if this is going to require a recall. And there are all kinds of factors that go into whether a positive test result for a pathogen, or even a finding for foreign matter, or for that matter, even a labeling issue might lead to a recall. So go through your steps in your plan, collect the information. Don't jump steps and automatically go to the recall. Figure out what information you need and collect it, and then your plan should inform you as to who you report that to. If you are the one who receives that first call, who do you report it to within the company to then discuss and share that information and determine if the larger crisis team should be assembled or not. So let's say you've figured out that yes, indeed, we need to issue a recall, and so now it becomes who calls FDA and tells them, who do they call, what are you going to say, and what are your next steps? And again, I would encourage you to watch webinar 3, where David Durkin discusses more of this interaction with FDA. But essentially, someone's going to have to call and say, hello, this is Amy Philpott with XYZ Fruit Company, and I'd like to speak to the FDA recall coordinator. So who is that person? And if you're in Georgia, North Carolina, or South Carolina, it's actually Nessie Esbit, I believe. And her name is on the FDA website. If you're in another state, you can always look that up, but it should be in your plan as well. You want to know what you're going to say, exactly what you're going to say before you call, and they're going to ask you, what are your next steps? So you want to have that down before you call. So what does this situation mean for a company in this position? First of all, because the problem was discovered before it caused illnesses, there's an opportunity to control the message. There's an opportunity to take your plan and run through it the way that you've practiced in a controlled fashion. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be some chaos. It doesn't mean there won't be elements that come up that you didn't expect, but that opportunity to control the situation and control the message and the pace is invaluable to a recalling company. Also, obviously, you can now prevent illnesses because you found this early on. That in turn will mean that it's very likely the recall will be less costly and less litigious. There's that opportunity to be proactive. And in webinar 5, when I talk about crisis communication and recall communications, I'll talk about how important it is to be proactive in your communications because of the perceptions that it leaves consumers and customers. Okay, so in the words of Dr. David Gombas, formerly with United Fresh Produce Association, you can have a bad recall or you can have a really bad recall. What makes the difference is a plan, okay? And I'm going to keep hitting this home in every webinar because it is so critical. If you have seen webinar 1, this crisis response process will look familiar. We're now going to apply this process, which can be applied to any crisis. We're going to apply it to a food safety issue. So let's say you've been notified, there's been some trigger. Okay, let's go with the example that we just finished. So you've been running tests on zone 1, let's say, and I'm not advocating that that be done in any way, but for the sake of this discussion, let's just say there was a test for some reason done on zone 1, meaning a food contact surface, and it came back positive. And there are all kinds of protocols about not shipping that product and whatnot that you should discuss with your food safety person and your technical person. I won't get into that here. For the sake of this discussion, there's a positive test result on one of your products, but you found out first. It wasn't somebody testing at retail. It wasn't your customer testing at the warehouse. It's in your possession. So now the question becomes, what do you do with that information? If you're the person that finds that out, and probably in this case it would be the food safety person, what do you do with that information? Who do you tell within your company? What more information do you want to collect before you and whoever you report this to make a decision as to whether you need to call together the bigger recall team? Is there any immediate action that you have to take? Do you need to shut the line down right away? Do you need to close the facility? Do you need to take any other kind of immediate action? These are the kinds of questions that your plan should bring to light in this first stage. Then, for sake of this example, let's say you or the person who discovered it and the person that they needed to report it to according to the plan decide, okay, this is serious, we want to bring the team together. So you assemble the team. Well, in your plan, you've already identified who's on the team. You've already identified how to contact them. You should already have a secure conference line. You need to decide who's going to run this meeting and make an outline of what you're going to discuss. Be very organized going into this meeting because as soon as your team finds out, there are going to be all kinds of additional questions you don't have answers to, and the conversation can get very cluttered and chaotic, and you want to have control of that meeting. In this first meeting, you can also review roles and responsibilities. Not that everyone is going to go into action right now, you're just preparing, right? Now, if you have the information that you need and you've already made that decision, yes, we're going to do a recall, then you may go into action. But typically, this first meeting is about sharing information, determining what more information we need, and so importantly, determining which external resources we want to bring in to help us, whether that's Beth at Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, whether it's your lawyer, whether it's another consultant. It might be somebody from the University of Georgia in food science, whoever you want to bring them in early. The earlier you bring your external resources in, the more help they can be. Then you're going to go out and very likely you're going to have to gather more information. You didn't get all of the information you need. The team brought up a lot more questions than you had answers for, and you really feel like you need more information. It may be more trace-back information, trace-forward information, customer lists, trying to get an idea of the scope of what the recall might be. The other thing you want to begin to do is prepare your communications. And no, you don't have all the information you need to be able to communicate right now, but the sooner that you can begin to plug in the gaps in your templates, in your plan, templates for the news release, templates for letters to customers, website statements, talking points, those sorts of things. If you can plug in the gaps and begin to do that, then that'll save you time later on. You're going to come back either as an entire team or maybe just part of the team that was responsible for collecting more information, and you're going to assess that information. You're going to determine what does it mean. There are some questions that you can use to guide this assessment. You know, if there's loss of life, if there's serious injury, if federal and state laws have been broken, if the product is unsafe for consumers, if you've had inquiries from media. All of these questions indicate that this is extremely serious and you need to move quickly and move definitively. And then at some point you have to decide what to do and what to say. Are you going to recall? If you're going to recall, how much are you going to recall? What are you going to recall? What are you going to tell customers to do with the recalled product? What will you tell consumers to do with the recalled product? What if you have product in your own facility? And in the case that I'm using, hopefully, because you knew you were testing a food contact surface, hopefully you did not ship the product. So it may be, if you have 100% of the product in your control, you may not even have a recall. You may have to just destroy that product. And of course, legal counsel specializing in FDA food law would be able to advise you of that. So these are all decisions that you have to make based on the situation that you have. Again, I'll reference webinars 3 and 4 for the regulatory aspect and the traceability aspect of a recall, which goes into this decision-making process. And then finally, once you've made the decision, it has to go into action. So everything that you've been doing, preparing your communication templates, which we'll go into more in webinar 5, that all gets distributed, and the staff that is responsible for communicating with the various audiences communicates. Your operations and your food safety staff is doing the helping with the internal investigation and preventive measures and corrective actions, the health hazard assessment. It all goes into action right now. And then once you are out of the news, I recommend you go right into your debriefing and your post-mortem. The reason is this: especially in a recall, but in most crises, there is no definitive end, like one day we're in it and then we all come back to work the next day and it's over with. It doesn't happen that way. A recall officially ends for different people on your team at different times. People communicating with customers could be in it for 8 weeks to try to convince customers, not to go someplace else, or to provide them with information that they need in order to start buying again. The people, your finance people who are taking care of claims, both from credit memos with customers as well as claims from a liability perspective, they may be dealing with this issue for months, if not years, depending on if they're illnesses, right? So it ends at different times. Your food safety and quality assurance person will be working with FDA for weeks, maybe months. Hopefully you can get those corrective actions in place quickly and it'll be over with in less than a couple of months. Nevertheless, at some point you have to move on. And even though some people on your team will be tying up these loose ends, once you're out of the news media, I recommend you come back and do a postmortem. You may have things to add later based on these experiences that other people will continue to have, but the sooner you can wrap this up and have the company move forward, at least for the bulk of the people, the better. Okay. Don't forget to thank those who helped. It's so important. Update your plan and your processes and procedures based on this experience. Don't waste this experience. You went through the pain. You successfully executed your plan, but you can always make improvements. So in summary, how do you get recall ready? Well, first of all, you complete this webinar series. This is a fabulous 5-part webinar series. I encourage you to watch every single one. If you have a plan, update it based on what you learn in these webinars. And if you don't have one, for heaven's sake, get one as quickly as possible. I know Beth and her team have resources available. Of course, the Recall Ready team has resources available, and there are others that can help too. Make sure everyone in your plan knows that they're in your plan. There's nothing worse than having a crisis hit and finding out that you're responsible for something major in the plan, or even minor for that matter. So notify and train everyone in your plan. There are Recall Ready events that you can look into. Make sure you test that plan and the team's ability to implement it, right? Because you want to know that you can actually use the plan, and then update that and practice it. I recommend every 12 to 18 months. Remember, once you've been through one recall, you've been through one recall. There's something different about every single one, so don't get complacent. Stay on top of it. That's what I have today. I hope everyone enjoyed.
I think that was perfect. You hit some incredibly important pieces that that I'm finding lots of our members and people that have reached out to us really need a lot of help with. So, for example, this was several years ago, but I feel like that it still pertains. But the point that you made about confirming that you actually have a problem before you push the go button on any kind of recall, I think is crucial. Mm-hmm. It is absolutely crucial. And once you have an initial problem, that would be a fantastic time to give me a call. If it's a food safety issue, give me a call. If it is any other type of issue, feel free to call the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. We've walked through several members here in the past few years with hurricane and disaster relief. We've had a couple with accidental employee deaths. So just being able to walk through and be a legal voice, help be that calm in the midst of the chaos. But what I wanted to bring forth was several years ago, we had a farmer down in South Georgia, and it was either a Thursday or a Friday, and it was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and FDA called The Atlanta recall coordinator gave him a call, and hello, this is my name, this is what I'm calling about, and then just very quickly just started throwing all of this information at this farmer. And this is what's happened. This is what we found. Your product has been found positive with a pathogen, and this is the pathogen. We are coming to your farm with a whole group of folks. We'll be there tomorrow, and we'll be there for 2 or 3 days, and we're just going to swab everything that we find. And then at the end of that, the FDA recall coordinator said, now, since there's a pathogen on your product, do you agree to issue a recall? Well, of course. The farmer says, well, yes, if it's mine, yeah, sure, I'll do it. So fast forward, FDA comes down, we get our Georgia Department of Agriculture involved, and so that those two organizations are out on the farm and they're swabbing everything in tandem. And because this gentleman had a food safety program, and he had cleaning records, sanitation records, shipping records, things of that nature, he was able to show that the issue that they found actually was not his. It was not his produce. But since he had said yes to issuing a foodborne or a recall, they made him maintain that, and he had to issue a recall. So if he would have been able to say and had the foreknowledge in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of all of that information just being flung at him, I'll work with you in any way. I'd like to see the test results. I'd like to see the traceability and the chain of custody that you guys have, and we can talk about a recall whenever you get down here. He would have been able to avoid a lot of heartache and a lot of restless nights. So I just think it's critical for our producers and our industry to work very respectfully and work very closely with our state and federal regulatory organizations, but also make sure that there is a confirmed issue and that it actually is yours before we agree to absolutely everything that's being asked of us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Beth, you brought up a good point, is that I liked the way that you described the discussion with FDA, because you don't ever want to just say, no, we're not going to issue a recall, right? Because that is going to give the wrong impression as well. But rather to say that appreciate this information according to our plan, or according to, our crisis plan or our incident response plan or whatever. I would like to collect some information from you and bring this to our team. We value public health. We always want to consider that in anything that we do. But right now I need to collect some information and let my team know as per our plan or as per our policy. And we will evaluate this quickly as possible.
Yes. Absolutely. And also I'm finding that the sooner that somebody reaches out to me, the sooner I'm typically able to help them understand if, for example, if they have a positive for listeria. Well, a positive for listeria does not necessarily mean that it's pathogenic listeria. There are lots of different species of listeria, and the Listeria monocytogenes is the main one that we're really interested in when it comes to a pathogenic threat. So what to do after that, and where did that positive come from? Is it final product testing? Is it zone 1 testing? Is it other testing? And then what are the requirements from a state? In Georgia, we have a few state requirements. when it comes to pathogens. So what are if you have any state requirements, what are they? And then what are the federal requirements? And so I've been able to come alongside and work with some of our farms and packing facilities and help them work through that initial state of finding a positive for listeria, for example, and then figuring out, okay, we need to speciate this, and then come to find out it is a confirmed non-monocytogenes. It was not monocytogenes. So just being able to bring in that third party that may have a more of a collective knowledge that you're just adding to your already stellar team on your farm or in your packing operation can only be beneficial. It can only be beneficial. This has been fantastic. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been great.
Absolutely. Now, I would remind all of our listeners of a couple of things. In webinar 1, Amy actually goes into a lot more detail about how to manage a recall, how to prepare for it, and she goes through in more detail the steps of the crisis response that we've seen on the past few slides. So if you're watching this webinar and you need more information on how to prepare, then make sure that you go back and you watch webinar 1, Managing a Crisis. But the other thing to remind everybody is this is a pre-recorded webinar, but again, you can still submit questions and we will answer them. To submit a question, please type your question into the question text box and press send located next to the text box. At the end of the webinar, all submitted questions will come to us and we will email all answers to the individual. We will also keep a running FAQ document on the GFVGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. In closing, I want to thank again Amy Philpott of Watson Green for sharing her time and expertise with us during this webinar. Additionally, I'd like to thank every one of you who have joined in. You will be receiving a post-webinar survey to provide feedback on this webinar, as well as to help guide future topics. And lastly, feel free to contact the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association or Amy with further questions. We encourage you to explore the handouts box on the side of your screen for useful tools related to today's topic. Thank you for your participation in this webinar. This concludes today's program.